There is a map in the British Library that no one ever talks about. It's not hidden. It's not classified. You can request it, sit at a long wooden table, and look at it yourself. I did. The librarians didn't stop me. They didn't warn me. They just slid it across the table like any other artifact. The map is dated 1809. It shows cities that don't exist anymore. Not ruins. Not ancient settlements lost to time. Fully developed cities. Roads, canals, districts, infrastructure. Places with names you will not find in any modern history book. At first, I assumed they were errors. Old cartographic mistakes. Explorers guessing at what lay beyond their borders. That's what we're taught to believe about maps like this. But then I noticed something that made my hands start shaking. The cities on that map disappear from all maps printed after 1815. Not slowly, not gradually, completely, as if someone erased them from reality. And that's when I realized something terrifying. The early 19th century isn't poorly documented because people were bad at record keeping. It's poorly documented because something happened that wasn't supposed to be remembered. We're told history moves forward in a straight line. Progress, steam engines, industry, enlightenment, nation-states, democracy, modernity. But when you actually examine the evidence, when you look at architecture, population data, city planning, engineering techniques, history doesn't move forward at all. It stutters. It collapses. And around the year 1810 to 1820, it resets. I didn't start looking for this. I stumbled into it the way people always do, by noticing something small that didn't fit. For me, it was buildings. Specifically, the old buildings in cities all over the world that are officially dated to the early 1800s. They're massive, over-engineered, stonework so precise it would be expensive even today. Foundations deep enough to support structures far larger than what actually stands on them. And the strange thing is, after 1820, that kind of construction just stops. Architecture becomes simpler, thinner, cheaper, less ambitious. We're told it's because of economics, wars, shifting styles. But that explanation collapses the moment you realize this pattern appears everywhere. Europe, Russia, North America, South America, Asia. Different cultures, different governments. Same sudden downgrade. That's not stylistic change. That's loss. And loss only happens after catastrophe. So I started looking for evidence of catastrophe. Not the kind we're taught about. Not battles and treaties and famous generals. I looked for discontinuities. And once you start looking, you can't stop seeing them. Entire populations vanish from census records between 1800 and 1820 with no explanation. Cities rebuilt on top of older foundations that don't match the newer street layouts. Basements that are actually first floors. Windows that were never meant to be underground. Doorways that lead nowhere. In city after city, there's a buried layer. Mud, ash, rubble. Archaeologists call it urban fill. A neutral phrase. A comfortable phrase. Because calling it what it actually looks like would raise too many questions. It looks like the aftermath of sudden, total destruction. I found newspaper reports from the early 1800s describing fires that don't behave like fires. Not spreading. Appearing all at once. Heat so intense that metal deforms and stone cracks. Wind strong enough to knock people flat. Appearing without storms. Light that comes before sound. Sound that comes before destruction. People didn't have the language to describe what they were seeing. So they used metaphors. They said the sky opened. They said the air burned. They said the city vanished in a single breath. And then, this is the part that matters, they stopped talking about it. By the mid-1800s, the tone of historical writing changes. Suddenly, everything is clean, orderly, explained. Wars have causes. Fires have origins. Deaths have numbers. The chaos is gone. It's like reading two different histories written by two different civilizations. I went to Rome. Walked the streets at night when the crowds were gone. You know what's strange about Rome? Not the ruins. What's strange is how many buildings clearly aren't ruins, but also aren't whole. Walls sliced cleanly at angles no collapse would create. Columns fused into surrounding stone. Ancient structures repurposed, not restored. As if the goal wasn't to preserve the past, but to hide how advanced it really was. Then I noticed something else. In cities all over the world, there are buildings officially dated to the 1700s or earlier, with construction techniques no one could replicate at the time. Stone blocks weighing tens of tons, fitted together with tolerances tighter than modern machinery allows. Perfect symmetry over massive distances. Drainage systems beneath cities that still function today. And yet, after the early 1800s, we suddenly lost the ability to build like that. Does that make sense? Did humanity forget how to cut stone? Forget how to design arches? Forget how to align structures with astronomical precision? Or did the people who knew how to do it disappear? There's a term that appears in academic literature, but is never explained to the public. Orphan technology. Tools, techniques, and structures with no clear developmental lineage. They just appear, fully formed, then vanish, like fingerprints with no body attached. I started mapping these orphan technologies, and they all cluster around one period, right before 1810, and they all stop appearing right after, which raises an uncomfortable question. What if the civilization that built them wasn't ancient? What if it was recent? What if it overlapped with the early modern world? And what if its destruction is the reason modern history looks the way it does? Look at the population numbers. Europe's population explodes after 1820, not gradually, explosively. As if land and infrastructure suddenly became available, as if entire cities were emptied. We're told this was due to improved medicine. But improved medicine doesn't create empty cities. Something else does. I found letters from engineers, architects, and surveyors working in the early 19th century. Men tasked with rebuilding. They describe foundations far larger than necessary. Subterranean chambers they couldn't explain. Materials they didn't know how to manufacture. And again, the same phrase appears. We do not know who built this. Imagine that. Standing inside a structure that predates you by maybe a few decades, and having no idea who made it. That's not antiquity. That's amnesia. And amnesia usually follows trauma. There's something else. If you overlay global disaster records between 1805 and 1815, you see something impossible. Massive fires, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, crop failures, atmospheric anomalies, all clustered tightly in time, across continents. Official explanations treat these as unrelated events. But statistically, they shouldn't overlap this way, unless they share a cause. I'm not saying what that cause was. I'm saying the pattern exists. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The early 19th century is presented as the birth of the modern world. But it looks a lot more like the aftermath of something that ended. A world simplified, reorganized, standardized, history rewritten into clean timelines with clear heroes and villains, complexity removed, questions erased. There's a reason we're taught about kings and battles instead of infrastructure and engineering. Because wars are easy to explain. Collapsed civilizations are not. And here's the final thing that keeps me awake at night. If something like this happened once, if a global civilization could be erased and replaced with a simpler version, if history could be edited so thoroughly that only fragments remain, then the question isn't what happened back then. The question is, could it happen again? And if it did, would we even recognize it? Or would we tell ourselves a story, a comfortable story, about wars, about accidents, about progress, while standing on foundations we no longer understand? There's a strange moment that happens when you look at old photographs long enough. Not the famous ones. Not the carefully curated images that appear in textbooks. I'm talking about the photographs that sit quietly in archives. The ones no one enlarges. The ones no one studies too closely. At first, everything looks normal. Then something starts to feel off. The streets are too wide. The buildings are too large. The windows are too tall for the number of people supposedly living there. And the cities feel empty, not abandoned, just underutilized, as if they were built for a population that never arrived, or a population that disappeared. I first noticed this while studying early photographs of North American cities taken in the 1840s and 1850s. Cities that were supposedly young, cities that were supposedly still developing, and yet they already had monumental architecture, massive stone buildings, perfectly aligned avenues, infrastructure far exceeding what the population numbers would justify. We're told this is ambition, optimism, the promise of progress. But ambition doesn't pour miles of stone foundations. Optimism doesn't build underground drainage systems capable of supporting millions. And progress doesn't usually forget how it got there. Then I noticed something else. Those early photographs almost never show construction. They show finished cities, as if they appeared fully formed. And by the time people arrive in large numbers, the architecture gets worse. Smaller, cheaper, simpler. That's backwards. History is not supposed to move backward. So I started asking a dangerous question. What if the world we think was built in the 19th century was actually inherited? Inherited from something that ended. There's a pattern historians avoid talking about. Because once you see it, the entire timeline starts to bend. Across Europe, Asia, the Americas, and parts of Africa, there is a strange architectural divide. Before the early 1800s, buildings are massive, precise, and unified in style, regardless of culture. After the early 1800s, buildings fragment into regional styles, reduced scale, and simplified engineering. It's as if something universal broke, and humanity rebuilt locally without understanding what came before. There's a reason so many old buildings have basements that were never meant to be underground. Windows sealed halfway up, doors that open into soil, staircases that descend into nothing. We're told this is urban development. But urban development doesn't bury entire floors across entire continents. Something else does. Sudden accumulation. Ash, mud, rubble, debris that arrives all at once. There's an uncomfortable silence in historical records between roughly 1805 and 1820. Not a lack of events, a lack of explanations. Cities burn, but no one agrees how. Populations drop, but no one agrees why. Whole regions change hands administratively without clear wars. And when history resumes, the world is reorganized, borders standardized, measurements unified, time zones synchronized, calendars aligned. It's as if chaos forced order, and order rewrote the chaos out of memory. Look closely at the language of early 19th century eyewitnesses. They struggle to describe what they saw. They talk about light before sound, heat without flame, wind without storms, sickness without wounds. These are not poetic flourishes. They are people reaching for words they don't have. And then, very suddenly, that language disappears. Descriptions become clean, scientific, contained. Because once something is named, it becomes controllable. There's a concept in psychology called narrative closure. The human brain needs a story that ends. If it doesn't get one, it invents one. History does the same thing. And the early 1800s look like a moment where the world desperately needed a story. A clean one. A believable one. One that didn't involve the collapse of something far larger than nations. Look at the maps. Maps before 1815 are crowded with place names that vanish afterward. Regions shrink. Territories rebrand. Empires dissolve quietly. And new nations rise almost overnight, with suspiciously pre-built capitals. There are cities whose founding dates don't match their infrastructure. Cities that supposedly sprang up in decades, but sit on foundations that would take centuries. We're told these were feats of industrial genius. But genius leaves blueprints. And, in many cases, there are none. Just stone. Perfectly cut stone. Aligned with the stars. Then there's the demographic puzzle. Population numbers before 1820 are inconsistent, incomplete, often contradictory. Then suddenly, census data becomes precise. Why? Did governments suddenly become competent? Or did something force them to start counting again from what remained? And here's the detail that ties everything together. After the early 19th century, architecture becomes obsessed with facades, thin stone veneers, decorative fronts, false grandeur, buildings that look monumental but are hollow, as if the memory of greatness survived, but not the ability to reproduce it. This isn't decay over time, it's replacement. A civilization doesn't usually forget its own methods unless the people who knew them are gone. And civilizations don't vanish quietly. They leave scars, buried layers, unanswered questions, orphaned technologies, and a deep, persistent feeling that something doesn't add up. If there was a global catastrophe in the early 1800s, it wouldn't look like an apocalypse movie. It would look like confusion, reconstruction, simplification, standardization, and most importantly, silence. Because survivors don't mythologize what destroyed them. They avoid it. They rename it. They bury it under wars, dates, and distractions. And generations later, all that remains are hints. Foundations too large, buildings too old, cities too advanced, and stories that don't quite make sense. History isn't lying to us. It's fragmented, and fragments always tell a stranger story than the whole. If the world reset once, it didn't do it cleanly. It left fingerprints, and those fingerprints are still everywhere, waiting. The strangest thing about abandoned cities isn't the emptiness. It's the order. When cities are destroyed by war, you see chaos, rubble everywhere, jagged damage, signs of struggle, improvised repairs, desperation. But when you study the cities that appear to have been abandoned in the early 19th century, what you see instead is something far more unsettling. Tables set, beds made, warehouses stocked, tools left where they were last used, entire districts frozen in a moment that never resolved. This doesn't look like evacuation under fire. It looks like departure with warning, as if someone knew they were not coming back. There are documented cases across Europe and Asia of so-called ghost cities discovered in the early 1800s. Places officially described as newly settled ruins, despite having infrastructure that would require generations to build. The explanations are always vague. Plague, migration, economic collapse. But none of those explain why the buildings remain intact. Plague leaves survivors. Migration leaves decay. Economic collapse leaves evidence of struggle. These places show none of that. They show silence. I found one account from a surveyor tasked with mapping a region newly absorbed into a growing empire. He wrote that he passed through a city with streets wider than anything in his homeland, with stone buildings taller than cathedrals, and yet not a single resident. No guards, no squatters, no scavengers, just wind moving through architecture designed for thousands. He didn't ask who built it. He was ordered to rename it. That's how history erases things. Not with destruction, with paperwork. Names are changed. Dates are reassigned. Structures are reclassified. What was once unknown origin becomes built in the early 1800s. What was once inheritance becomes achievement. And once enough time passes, the question disappears. But infrastructure doesn't lie. Look beneath modern cities, and you'll find systems no one remembers installing. Sewer tunnels, too large for their documented populations. Drainage channels carved through solid stone. Water systems that rely on gravity-fed precision over enormous distances. These are not the work of rushed expansion. They are the work of long-term planning, of a civilization confident in its future. And then that confidence ends. After the early 19th century, everything becomes modular, replaceable, standardized. Cast iron instead of carved stone, brick instead of monoliths. Function over permanence. This isn't innovation. It's recovery. When something catastrophic happens, survival matters more than beauty. Speed matters more than mastery. That's what post-catastrophe architecture looks like. Now, consider the timeline we're taught. The early 1800s are supposed to be an era of growth. Industry, population increase, expansion. But growth leaves continuity. This period shows rupture. The records don't just thin out. They reset. Calendars standardized. Measurements unified. Time synchronized. Global coordination emerges suddenly, not gradually. Why would a fractured world suddenly agree on how to measure itself? Unless coordination was necessary. Unless something forced cooperation. Unless chaos demanded order. There's a reason the modern world emerges so quickly after this period. Railroads, factories, bureaucracies, central banks, national identities. It's not evolution. It's consolidation. Survivors don't experiment. They stabilize. They rebuild what they can understand. They simplify what they can't. And most importantly, they control the narrative. Because narrative prevents panic. There's a psychological phenomenon where populations that survive mass trauma collectively suppress the cause if acknowledging it threatens social cohesion. They replace it with manageable stories. Wars, heroes, villains, natural disasters, anything that preserves the idea of control. Because the alternative, that civilization itself is fragile, is unbearable. And fragility is the one thing modern history refuses to teach. Instead, we're taught inevitability. Progress was inevitable. Modernity was inevitable. Our world was always coming. But inevitability is comforting. And comfort is rarely true. Look at how quickly knowledge disappears. Techniques used for centuries vanish within a generation if the people who practice them are gone. Languages die. Crafts die. Entire engineering disciplines vanish without apprentices. Now imagine that happening on a global scale. Imagine losing not just people, but continuity. Imagine inheriting structures you cannot fully replicate. Imagine being tasked with explaining them. That's when myths form. That's when timelines stretch. That's when dates get pushed backward or forward to fit a story. It's safer to say ancient than recent but unexplained. Ancient absolves responsibility. Recent demands answers. This is why so many advanced structures are pushed deep into antiquity. Because if they're ancient, no one asks who lost the knowledge. But if they're recent, someone failed. Someone survived something they don't want to talk about. And silence is the most consistent artifact of the early 19th century. Silence where there should be detail. Silence where there should be records. Silence where there should be grief. There are no global memorials. No worldwide days of mourning. No universal acknowledgement of loss. Which is strange. Because if the early 1800s were truly as peaceful and progressive as portrayed, why does everything afterward feel like recovery? Why do cities rebuild instead of expand? Why does architecture regress? Why do nations obsess over borders, control, and standardization? Why does humanity suddenly become afraid of complexity? Complex systems collapse catastrophically. Simple systems survive. That's a lesson learned the hard way. There's another clue hidden in plain sight. Education. Before the 19th century, education is decentralized, local, apprenticeship-based. Afterward, it becomes standardized. Curriculums, grades, ages, uniform instruction. This isn't enlightenment. This is damage control. Because when knowledge continuity is broken, it must be rebuilt quickly and consistently. Standardization prevents deviation. Deviation leads to questions. And questions lead backward. Backward to things no one wants revisited. Every civilization that survives catastrophe rewrites its past. Not maliciously, instinctively. Because memory hurts. And survival requires forgetting. If there was a global event, whatever its nature, that shattered an advanced world, the people who followed wouldn't call it an apocalypse. They'd call it a turning point, a revolution, a war, anything smaller than what it truly was. And centuries later, all that remains are inconsistencies, buildings too advanced, cities too empty, timelines too clean, and a feeling, persistent nagging, that the story skips a page. Or several. The question isn't whether this happened. The question is why the evidence feels so carefully misaligned. Why explanations almost fit, but not quite. Why the deeper you look, the more modern history feels like reconstruction notes rather than original plans. And why the early 19th century sits like a scar across the entire world. If part 1 was about noticing the fracture, then part 2 is about recognizing the pattern. And patterns don't exist without cause. Which brings us to the most uncomfortable part of all. If a civilization advanced enough to reshape the planet could collapse, not in ancient myth, but in documented history, then progress isn't permanent. And our confidence may be inherited, not earned. If you're ready, part 3 goes where most histories. Subscribe to this channel now.